So apologies that there was a short break. Only for some reason, my laptop is still dying. I think I have to repair or change. But as we are saying, as I was saying even, before there was a cut in the recording, uh, it's very important that we are able to, whether you like it or not, analyze the readings, read it repeatedly. And as I was saying, as a practical routine, before the last recording ended, read each transcript at least 3 times. During the first, focus on understanding the overall story. During the second, identify recurring ideas and surprising statements. During the third, begin marking possible meaning units that may later become chunks. And research, because researchers who immerse themselves in their data before coding usually produce richer, more coherent findings because they understand not only what participants said, but also the context in which these things were said. Let's go now to chunking because this is where the next series goes in. Now that we arrive at one of the most overlooked steps in qualitative analysis, chunking, many students believe that once they have read in between chunking, if coding answers the question, what is this piece of data about? Chunking first answers the question, what exactly is the piece of data I am coding? Chunking is the process of dividing a transcript into meaningful units. A meaning unit is the smallest portion of text that expresses one complete idea. It's not necessarily one sentence, nor is it an entire paragraph. Sometimes a single sentence contains one complete idea and becomes one chunk. At other times, 3 or 4 sentences work together to express a single thought and therefore become one chunk. The researcher must decide where one idea ends and another begins. One mistake beginners make is coding an entire interview as one. Imagine a respondent discussing training, equipment, leadership, budget, and coordination in a single interview. If you treat the whole interview as one chunk, you will not know which part relates to which research objective. Another mistake is the opposite, coding every individual word or every sentence separately. This destroys the context of what the respondents is trying to communicate. The goal is to preserve complete ideas, not isolate words, and not entire conversations. Think of reading a book. You naturally recognize when one paragraph discusses a topic. Your mind already separates ideas without realizing it. Chunking simply makes this process deliberate. As researchers, we identify where one meaningful thought begins and where another meaningful thought ends, so that each idea can later receive an appropriate code. Here's a practical workflow. Print one transcript or open it on your computer. Read it slowly. Whenever the respondent shifts from one complete idea to another, draw a line, or insert a paragraph break. Label these as chunk 1, chunk 2, chunk 3, and so on. Do not worry about coding yet. Your only task is to separate the transcript into meaningful analytical units. Remember this principle. We do not code interviews. We code meaning units. Learning to identify these units is one of the most important skills in qualitative research because every later stage, coding, clustering, and thematizing, depends on the quality of your chunking. Chunking in practice. The previous slide introduced us to chunking. This slide teaches us how to recognize a chunk. The key rule is simple. A chunk is defined by the completeness of the idea, not by its length. Some chunks may consist of only one sentence. Others may require several sentences. Length is not the criterion. Meaning is. Look at the first example. Our doctrine mentions cognitive warfare, but nobody really knows how to apply it operationally. This entire statement expresses one complete idea. The doctrine exists, but it has not been operationalized. Even though the sentence contains two clauses, they belong together because both describe the same issue. Therefore, they become one chunk. The second example is we have no dedicated office responsible for cognitive warfare. This is a different idea. It's no longer about doctrine, it's about organizational structure. Although the statement is shorter, it deserves its own chunk because it expresses a distinct analytical meaning. Now imagine a longer response. We have a policy manual, but most personnel have never read it. Training is also irregular because there is no annual budget allocation. Should this be one chunk or two? The answer is two. The first sentence discusses policy awareness. The second discusses training resources. They are related, but they answer different analytical questions. Therefore, they should receive separate chunks and eventually different codes. So, here is a practical exercise. Take one interview, highlight every place where the respondent changes topics, then ask yourself, if I assign one code to this section, would the entire section still make sense? If the answer is no, divide it further. Continue until every chunk expresses only one coherent idea. This discipline will make your coding much more accurate and even consistent. Let's move to part 5, which is coding. Once the transcript have been divided into meaningful chunks, we finally arrive at coding. Coding is the process of attaching a short analytical label to every chunk. The code summarizes what the respondent is saying without yet interpreting why it is happening. Think of a code as a concise description of the central idea contained in one meaning unit. The slide provides several excellent examples. A respondent says, training happens only when foreign partners conduct exercises. Instead of copying this long quotation repeatedly, the researcher assigns the code dependent training. Another respondent says there's no annual curriculum. This becomes the code absent curriculum. A third participant explains that different units define cognitive warfare differently. The researcher assigns the code conceptual ambiguity. Notice that these codes are short descriptive phrases. They capture the essence of the chunk without rewriting the respondent's statement. The original quotation remains in the transcript, but the code allows the researcher to compare similar statements across many participants. An important principle is that different respondents may receive the same code. Suppose 10 participants all mention irregular training schedules, their wording may differ, but if they are expressing the same idea, they all receive irregular training schedule. Later, those repeated codes become evidence of a broader pattern. To practice coding, prepare a table with 4 columns: chunk number, verbatim quotation, initial code, related indicator. Work through your transcript one chunk at a time. Resist the temptation to invent complicated codes. Good codes are usually short, clear, and descriptive. They should help you quickly recognize what the respondent is discussing without forcing an interpretation that the evidence does not yet support. Codes, we need to understand, are descriptions, not interpretations. This slide presents one of the most important principles in qualitative research. Codes describe, they do not interpret. Many beginning researchers skip directly from a respondent's quotation to a conclusion. They begin explaining why something happened before they have carefully described what the participant actually said. Suppose a respondent says, "We only conduct training when partner countries visit." A descriptive code would be dependent training. These codes simply summarize the respondent's statement. An interpretive label such as institutional neglect would be inappropriate at this stage because it already assumes a cause that has not yet been established through the evidence. Interpretation belongs later, during thematic analysis. At the coding stage, your responsibility is simply to organize the data faithfully. Think of yourself as cataloging books in a library. You are placing similar books on the same shelf. You are not yet writing a review of the books. So we need to contrast good versus poor research practice in this line. Strong researchers often begin developing a preliminary code book because interviews start. Because they already know their indicators, they can anticipate many possible codes. As new ideas emerge during fieldwork, the codebook can be refined. Poor researchers, on the other hand, invent entirely new codes after every interview without consistency. The result is that identical ideas receive different labels, making comparison and triangulation extremely difficult. So start a living code book as soon as you begin analyzing data. Every time you create a new code, record its name, definition, and example quotation. Before inventing another code, check whether an existing one already captures the same idea. Consistency is one of the foundations of trustworthy qualitative analysis. The goal is to be able to build a code book. After several interviews, you may have already a dozen of codes. If you simply keep these codes in your head or scattered throughout different transcripts, analysis quickly becomes confusing. This is why qualitative researchers develop a code book, a structured reference document that records every code used in the data or in the study. A code book is much more than a list of labels. Each code should include at least three elements: the code, a clear definition, an example from the data. For example, the slide presents the code-dependent training. Its definition explains that training occurs only when external partners initiate exercise rather than through the organization's own capacity-building efforts. An accompanying quotation illustrates exactly when this code should be applied. Another researcher reading the code book would immediately understand when to use the code. So the code book serves several important purposes. First, it promotes consistency. When similar statements appear in different interviews, even if they are different interview but similar statements, they receive the same code. Second, it increases transparency because other researchers can understand exactly how coding decisions were made. Third, it supports team coding. If multiple researchers are analyzing the same data, everything follows the same coding definitions. As your analysis progresses, your codebook will necessarily evolve. Necessarily evolve. Some codes may be merged because they describe the same phenomenon. Others may be divided into specific codes, uh, or more detailed codes. This refinement is normal, provided every change is documented. So for your own study, begin constructing your code book now. Even if you have not yet completed data collection, create a spreadsheet and have these columns: code, definition, example quotation, indicator, and notes. Update this document continuously throughout the study so that by the time you begin clustering and thematizing analysis, you will already have an organized analytical foundation rather than hundreds of disconnected codes scattered across your transcripts. So, clustering codes. So, by this point in the research process, you have already completed your interviews, transcribed the recordings, divided the transcripts into meaningful chunks, and assigned codes to every chunk. So after analyzing 10, 20, or 30 interviews, you may already have hundreds of individual codes. The next question becomes, what do I do with all these codes? This is where clustering begins. Clustering is a process of grouping related codes together. Think of it as organizing books in a library. So every book has its own title, but books discussing the same subject are placed on the same shelf. Similarly, every code represents one specific observation, but many codes describe different aspects of the same broader issue. Clustering allows us to organize these related codes into meaningful groups. For example, suppose you have the following codes: no doctrine, outdated doctrine, conflicting doctrine, and unclear doctrine. Although these are four different codes, they all refer to problems involving organizational doctrine. So instead of discussing each code separately, we group them under the cluster doctrinal issues. Likewise, the codes no instructors, weak curriculum, irregular exercises may be grouped under the cluster training deficiencies. Notice what clustering accomplishes. Instead of trying to analyze 100 separate codes, you may only need to analyze 15 or 20 clusters. This reduces complexity without throwing away important information. The individual codes remain available, but they are now organized into broader analytical categories. Print your code book or display it on a large screen. Cut each code into separate pieces of paper or write each code on a sticky note. Post it, if you will. Then begin grouping similar codes together. Do not worry about naming the group. Simply ask which of these codes appear to discuss the same general issue. After the groups begin to emerge naturally, assign each group a descriptive cluster. This hands-on activity makes clustering much easier than trying to do everything inside a spreadsheet. Always remember that clustering is still part of organizing the data. You are not yet explaining why problems occur. You are simply bringing together pieces of evidence that belong to the same analytical family. This organization prepares the way for the next step with developing themes. Before we start talking about developing themes, let's talk first about the logic of clustering. What's the logic of clusterings? So, what do we get from here? Many students think clustering is simply placing similar codes beside each other. While similarity is important, clustering requires something deeper. We need to ask what common phenomenon connects these codes. In other words, we are not merely sorting labels, we are identifying patterns. So there are three-stage progressions, as you can see: individual codes, code clusters, and themes. This sequence is extremely important because it prevents researchers from jumping too quickly to conclusions. Every stage has its own purpose. Individual codes describe specific pieces of evidence. Clusters organize related codes. Themes interpret what those clusters collectively reveal. So imagine that you have several codes such as delayed procurement, insufficient budget, equipment shortage, and frequent equipment breakdown. These codes are not identical, but they are connected. They all concern the organization's ability to provide operational resources. Rather than discussing each separately, you may cluster them under resource constraints. Now ask yourself another question. What larger issue do these resource constraints reveal? Perhaps they indicate limited organizational capacity or institutional underinvestment. That broader interpretation becomes the theme. But notice that we cannot reach the theme until we have first completed the clustering process. A common mistake is giving a cluster the same name as one of its code. For example, if the codes are weak curriculum, regular exercises, limited instructors, the cluster should not simply be called weak curriculum. That would ignore the other codes. Instead, choose a name that captures what all the codes share, such as training deficiencies or capacity development challenges. As you review your own data, practice asking three questions repeatedly. What does this code describe? Which other codes describe something similar, and what larger issue connects them? Answering these questions systematically will naturally move your analyses from individual observations toward meaningful patterns without forcing conclusions prematurely. Let's move forward and talk about developing themes. So after clustering comes one of the most intellectually demanding parts of qualitative research, developing themes. Many students think themes are simply the most common answers given during interviews. That's not correct. A theme is much more than frequency. A theme explains what the evidence collectively means. The slide asks us to distinguish between two questions: codes, what was said, and themes, what does everything together mean? Magkaiba. This shift is extremely important because research contributes knowledge through explanation, not merely through description. Consider the example on the slide. Several clusters are identified as doctrinal issue, weak coordination, limited authority. Individually, these clusters describe different organizational problems. And together, they reveal something larger: institutional fragmentation. That phrase is no longer describing one specific problem. Instead, it explains the relationship among several different organizational weaknesses. Another concern is about having no curriculum, limited instructors, irregular exercises. Individually, these are training-related clusters. Together, they suggest a deeper explanation: insufficient capacity development. Again, the theme explains why several related problems continue to exist. So when developing themes, avoid simply combining several code names. Instead, ask yourself, if I explain these clusters to someone who has never read my interview, what larger story would I tell? The answer should capture the underlying meaning rather than simply repeat the labels. So write each chat cluster on a separate card. Spread them across the table. Then begin asking which clusters seem to describe different parts of the same organizational reality. Once several clusters naturally belong together, write a sentence explaining the common issue they reveal. That sentence usually contains the beginning of a strong theme. Only after writing the sentence should you decide on the final theme title. So, in fact, we can look, for example, at Panket's coding framework. So, we try to demonstrate the complete analytical progression using Panket's proposal. It shows that qualitative analysis is never random. Every stage builds logically upon the previous one. The movement is always from specific observations toward broader explanation. So the process begins with initial codes such as no policy basis, fragmented coordination, and instructor certification needed. These codes come directly from individual interview chunks. They describe what respondents actually said without adding interpretation. The next step is clustering. The researcher notices that no policy basis belongs with other policy-related concerns, forming the cluster doctrinal gap. Fragmented coordination contributes to the cluster coordination weakness. Instructor certification needed becomes part of capacity building. Finally, these clusters are interpreted to produce themes such as institutional fragmentation or insufficient capacity development. Notice how the language changes. The codes describe individual problems. The cluster organize similar problems. The themes explain what these problems collectively reveal about the organization being studied. So, themes are researcher constructed explanations. They are not direct quotations from respondents. So, no participant will likely say our organization suffers from institutional fragmentation. That is the researcher's interpretation after examining all the evidence together. The strength of the theme depends on how well it is supported by the underlying codes and clusters. So, and that's something we have to pay attention to. Huh? Next, thematic analysis. No? So, this slide emphasizes one of the most misunderstood ideas in qualitative research. Thematic analysis is interpretation. It's not simply counting responses or identifying the most frequently mentioned issues. Frequency is useful, but it is never enough to justify a theme. The slide presents 3 of the 5 characteristics of a valid theme. First, a theme should appear repeatedly across multiple interviews or data sources. So a single respondent may raise an interesting point, but unless additional evidence supports it, that observation may not represent a meaningful pattern. Second, a theme must answer a research objective. This is one of the most important principles in thesis writing. Every theme should directly contribute to answering a statement of the problem. So if a theme cannot be connected to one of your research objectives, it may be interesting, but it does not belong to your study. Third, a theme should be supported by multiple evidence sources. Um, Interviews alone are rarely sufficient. Strong qualitative studies, triangulate evidence using key informant interviews, focus group discussions, document analysis, organizational records, and even relevant literature. So when several independent sources support the same interpretation, the credibility of your finding increases substantially. Think of your findings as if you were presenting a legal case. A judge is unlikely to accept a conclusion based on only one witness. The conclusion becomes convincing when several witnesses, official documents, and physical evidence all point toward the same explanation. Qualitative research follows the same principle. A theme gains strength when different sources independently support the same interpretation. So, as you prepare for chapter 4, review every proposed theme using 3 questions. Does this theme appear consistently across multiple respondents or data sources? Which specific statement of the problem does this theme answer? And what evidence supports this interpretation? I said 5 and we've only tackled 3, so let's continue with the 4th and the 5th. So we learned the valid theme should appear repeatedly, answer a research objective, and be supported by multiple sources of evidence. Now let's complete 2 remaining criteria, and these last 2 are what distinguishes a competent qualitative researcher from someone who merely summarizes interview responses. So the 4th criteria is that a theme must explain, not merely describe. Description tells us what happened. Explanation tells us why it happened. Suppose your respondents repeatedly mention that training is conducted only once a year. A descriptive theme might be limited training opportunities. With these, with these, um, so while these summarizes the respondents, it does not yet explain the situation. So a stronger theme would be institutional underinvestment in capacity development. Because it proposes an explanation supported by evidence, the researcher is no longer listing observations. The researcher is interpreting patterns. Consider another example. Imagine that many respondents mention delayed procurement, unavailable spare parts, outdated equipment, and long repair periods. A descriptive statement would simply say respondents experience equipment shortages. An explanatory theme would state operational readiness is constrained by fragmented logistics and procurement processes. Notice the difference. The first tells us what respondents experienced. The second explains the organizational mechanism producing those experiences. The fifth criterion is that every theme must connect back to theory. This is often neglected by beginning researchers. They think that once they have interviewed enough participants, theory is no longer necessary. In fact, theory becomes even more important during interpretation. The conceptual framework serves as the lens through which the evidence is understood. It transforms isolated observations into knowledge that can be applied beyond one organization or one study. For example, if your conceptual framework identifies doctrine, organization, and training as the dimensions of organizational readiness, your team should eventually return to these concepts. Suppose your team is institutional fragmentation. You should be able to explain how fragmented coordination reflects weaknesses in organizational structure or doctrine as described in your framework. If the theme cannot be connected to the conceptual framework, it may be an interesting observation, but it remains analytically incomplete. So review every theme that you will develop eventually. Ask, does this theme explain why the phenomenon exists? Or does it merely summarize what was said? And which part of my conceptual framework supports this interpretation? If you cannot answer both questions, refine the theme. Strong themes always move from evidence to explanation and from explanation back to theory. This is what transforms qualitative research into a scholarly contribution rather than a collection of interview or of a collection of interview summaries. But how do we do that? Well, the process that we implement is always triangulation. One of the greatest strengths of qualitative research is that it does not rely on only one source of information. Instead, it seeks convergence of evidence through a process called triangulation. Triangulation simply means confirming an interpretation by examining whether different sources point toward the same conclusion. Imagine interviewing one participant who says that the organization lacks adequate training. That statement alone is interesting, but is not yet convincing. Now imagine that five other participants make similar observations. Then you examine official training records and discover that only one major exercise was conducted during the previous year. Finally, organizational reports also identify insufficient training opportunities. Suddenly, the evidence begins to converge. multiple independent sources are telling the same story. This convergence is what gives qualitative findings credibility. Researchers should never accept a theme simply because one participant expressed it passionately. A strong theme survives comparison across interviews, focus group discussions, documents, observations, and even relevant literature. When these different sources reinforce one another, confidence in the interpretation increases significantly. However, triangulation is not only about agreement. Sometimes different sources contradict one another. For example, senior officers may report that training programs are adequate while junior personnel describe them as insufficient. Rather than viewing this contradiction as a problem, the researcher should investigate why these different perspectives exist. Divergence often reveals important organizational dynamics that deserve careful analysis. As you analyze your own data, create a triangulation matrix. List your developing themes in the first column, then create separate columns for KIA evidence, FGD evidence, and document analysis, observations, and literature. Fill in each column with the evidence supporting the theme. If one column remains empty, ask yourself whether additional data collection or further analysis is needed before accepting the theme. Remember, triangulation is not a requirement added at the end of the study. It is a way of thinking throughout the entire research process. Every interpretation should be challenged by asking what other evidence supports this conclusion. Let's look at triangulation in the strong proposals that were submitted. So this study demonstrates how triangulation appears in actual research proposals. Strong qualitative proposals do not merely state that triangulation will be used, they explain how it will be implemented and why it strengthens the credibility of the findings. The proposal by Olfindo illustrates a comprehensive strategy. It combines document analysis, comparative case analysis, interview, cross-case pattern matching, and an audit trail. Notice that these methods are not used independently. Instead, they continually verify one another. So if interview data suggests weak institutional coordination, the researcher examines organizational documents, compares findings across cases, and records every analytical decision in an audit trail. So every conclusion becomes transparent and traceable. The Honog's proposal also demonstrates another excellent practice. It incorporates data triangulation, institutional triangulation, and methodological triangulation while maintaining a reflexive journal throughout the analysis. So the researcher documents not only what participants said, but also how coding decisions evolved, how teams were refined, and how personal assumptions were managed during interpretation. This reflexivity increases the trustworthiness of the analysis. So the important lesson is that triangulation is not simply using three methods because a textbook says so. Each method should answer the same research objective from a different perspective. Suppose your objective is to examine training capability. Interviews reveal how personnel experience the training. Documents reveal official policies and schedules. Observations reveal how training actually occurs. Together, these perspectives provide a more complete understanding than any one source alone. So when deciding your own study, avoid treating KII, FGD, and document analysis as separate activities. Instead, ask the same analytical question across all three methods. For example, interview. How often are simulation exercises conducted? FGD. Do participants believe the frequency is sufficient? Document analysis. How many simulation exercises were officially conducted during the previous year? Although the questions differ slightly, they all investigate the same indicator. This is the essence of an effective triangulation. Now, of course, we've already mentioned the three types of triangulation. Not all triangulation is the same. Depending on your research design, you may use one type or combine several. This introduces three of the most common: data triangulation, institutional triangulation, and methodological triangulation. The first is data triangulation. Here, the researcher gathers information from different respondent groups, different time groups, different operational settings. Suppose you're studying organizational readiness. Rather than interviewing only managers, you also interview supervisors, frontline personnel, technical specialists. And if all these groups independently identify the same issue, your interpretation becomes much stronger. If their views differ, you gain insight into how perspectives vary across institutional levels. The second is institutional triangulation. Sometimes one organization cannot provide enough evidence to answer a broader research question. Researchers therefore examine multiple institutions. For example, a study on emergency preparedness might compare several regional offices rather than relying on a single site. If similar themes emerge across different organizations, the findings become more transferable and less dependent on local circumstances. The third is methodological triangulation, perhaps the most familiar form in qualitative research. Here, different methods investigate the same phenomena. Interviews capture personal experiences, FGD reveal collective perception or group interaction, documents provide official records and policies. Observation shows actual practice. Each method contributes a different kind of evidence, allowing the researcher to construct a richer and even a more balanced interpretation. Always remember, triangulation is not about collecting more data. Triangulation is about increasing confidence in your interpretation through carefully selected sources of evidence. Now let's go to the last part in preparation for our class on Saturday, face-to-face class on Saturday. So we present one of the most important distinctions in qualitative research. A theme is not a finding. So many students believe that once they have developed themes, chapter 4 is finished. In reality, themes are only the foundation of the findings. The researcher must still explain what those themes reveal about the phenomenon under investigation. The slide illustrates this beautifully. The theme is fragmented coordination. This is a classification. It groups together evidence concerning poor coordination across different units. However, the finding goes much further. Institutional coordination remains episodic because existing governance mechanisms lack permanent coordinating structures, standardized procedures, and clearly assigned responsibilities. Notice what has happened. The finding explains why fragmented coordination exists. It identifies governance mechanisms, organizational structures, procedures, and responsibilities as contributing factors. The finding is no longer simply labeling evidence. It is answering the research question through interpretation. Think of themes as chapter headings. They organize the discussion. Findings are the actual arguments developed under those headings. Every finding should integrate evidence from interview, focus group, discussion, observations, literature, and theory. The researcher weaves these different sources together to explain the phenomenon rather than merely reporting what the respondents actually said. So, when writing chapter 4, you need to resist the temptation to present one quotation after another, followed by a brief summary. Instead, we will follow by stating the finding, presenting supporting evidence from multiple sources, explaining how the evidence supports the finding, and connect the findings to the conceptual framework and relevant literature. But we will still work on this one Saturday morning. By following this structure, the findings becomes analytical rather than descriptive, and readers will not only understand what participants experience, they will understand why those experiences occurred and how they answer the statement of the problem. That, my friend, is the ultimate goal of qualitative analysis. So, as we will clarify further, no? So you see, there's only 34 slides. So I'm done in more or less 10 minutes, and this is your Friday class already. These teams classify, findings explain. So this slide reinforces one of the most important lessons at this point. It is so important that it deserves to be repeated. Themes classify, but findings explain. So if you remember only one lesson from today's lecture, please let it be this one. Many beginning researchers produce a chapter 4 that consists of themes followed by quotations from respondents. Unfortunately, this is not yet a research finding. What they have done is simply organize similar responses into one category. The reader still does not know why training is weak, what factors contribute to it, or what this reveals about the organization. A finding answers those questions. Suppose the theme is weak training. A finding may read training capability remains inconsistent because the organization lacks an institutionalized curriculum, sufficiently qualified instructors, and a sustainable training program independent of external partners. Notice the difference. This statement does three things simultaneously. First, it identifies the condition, training capability remains inconsistent. Second, it explains the causes, lack of curriculum, instructors, and sustainability. Third, provides an interpretation that answers the research objective. Think of the relationship this way. Evidence is what respondents said. Quotes describe individual pieces of evidence. Cluster organize related codes. Themes classify related clusters. Findings explain the meaning of those themes. Every finding should therefore answer three questions. What is happening? Why is it happening? How does this answer the statement of the problem? Now consider the test presented in the slide. Can the reader understand not only what occurred, but why it occurred and how it relates to the conceptual framework? If the answer is yes, you have produced a finding. If the reader only knows what happened, then you have merely written a theme. So review every section always. Write your findings first, then use the evidence to prove them, not the other way around. So the complete analytical flow is as follows. Okay? So this is the big picture. No, this is a complete flow. So the workflow reminds us that every stage has a function and that good findings are actually built on a strong foundation. So never rush to the end of the analytical process. Every stage exists because it prepares the next one. Do not forget that. So there are stages to consider. So your research objectives, your concept, your dimensions, your indicators, and your instrument. Check that out. And then you can collect your data and transcribe. Well, actually, the 6 to 10 is more than this, but for some reason, my slide ends here. So we've discussed already the distinction between in the development of the instrument, but also we've looked at how you should process from a code to a chunk to a cluster until it arrives a theme, until it becomes a finding. On Saturday, we will start face-to-face synchronously discuss about uh, presenting the data in your chapter 4. Everything we spoke about today are the dirty tricks of the trade. Something you have to do thoroughly, but never always report. So I hope that my suggested activities made sense. Thank you very much for attending today's class in my absence. And I'll see you tomorrow. Uh, Call time dictated by Miss Hannah. Thank you and have a nice day.